Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we take up an issue that over the past several decades, in some ways since the rise of social media and the corruption of politics in various countries around the world, has led to the personal encounter of countless millions of people with bullying. One looks over the long history of humanity, coercive power, invasions, conquests have always taken place. That's a form of bullying. We see it in the world today all over. We see it in what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians in the form of genocide. That's, I would say, an extreme form of bullying. But what bullying comes down to in its essence is an intimidation of power on the strong over against the weak in a way that is experienced as negative and can often be a terrifying phenomenon, particularly in the schoolyard when youngsters are very naive, very idealistic, very trusting, and to have the schoolyard bully weigh in and throw their weight around and engage in physical intimidation is always an unnerving experience. And it's often not very easy to know how to deal with the bully. There was a book written by one of the theoreticians in nonviolence called The Myth of the Tribe about 30 years ago, where he said that the greatest conundrum in history and in social affairs is when there's a group of tribes living relatively peacefully together, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, over the hill comes a aggressive, assertive, coercive tribe that is determined to take all the water and subordinate the peaceful tribes. What do they do? How does one protect oneself against the bully? Is it superior coercive force? Is it nonviolent resistance? And what role does the culture play in either supporting bullying or modifying bullying? We've seen today announced just a few minutes ago, actually, the International Criminal Court is seeking indictments now against Benjamin Netanyahu and his defense minister Gallant, against Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas, and two of his lieutenants for the massacres on October 7th and the genocide subsequent to that. That's an attempt to ameliorate bullying, but it is questionable how one deals the most effectively with coercive force in the world. It's a deep, deep and abiding question that has challenged humanity from our very beginnings. And today we're going to explore it probably more in personal terms, but also in geostrategic terms. So I'm delighted today to welcome back Bob Rees. You all know he's a professor of Mormon studies at the Graduate Theological Union at UC Berkeley. He's taught Mormon studies for many, many years in various institutions of note in the academic world. He's got a very Renaissance curiosity, so he's convened numerous sessions on Humanity Rising across a wide domain of fields. So I'm very grateful, Bob, for putting together this panel with one of the world's foremost specialists in bullying. So Bob, I turn the program now over to you.
Thank you, Jim, very much. And welcome, Nicholas, to come into this conversation. I was privileged a number of years ago to meet Nicholas. I was part of a research institute in the Santa Cruz Mountains called the Institute of Heart Math. And we did training of educators. And one of the people who came to one of those trainings was Nicholas, and we became fast friends. We immediately felt a resonance, and that led to my being invited by Nicholas to be on the board of the organization he has started called No Bully. And then we were both advisors at a program at California State University in San Jose. And since then, we've just kept this close friendship between our families. And I was privileged to visit with Nicholas and his wife, Maria, in London a couple of years ago. So Nicholas, it's welcome to invite you back onto this side of the water and to be able to introduce you to this distinguished community of Ubiquity University's Humanity Rising. And that began during COVID and the need for us to be together to rise. And I have been delighted to tell other people about your work, Nicholas, and the new work that you started once you moved back to Europe called The Power of Zero. So welcome to Humanity Rising, and I look forward to our time together this morning.
Thank you, Bob. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I think that one of the things that immediately arises for people is the kind of a definition of what is bullying, and we speak of this as bullying in America. Having lived in various countries, maybe you could say something about why we have titled this particular session Bullying in America.
Well, you and I have been talking a long time about the phenomenon of bullying. My organization, Power Zero, is focused on bullying in schools. But you and I have long reflected on this question, and I think we're going to touch into this later in the show on how bullying isn't just in schools and how it seems to be a phenomenon that's growing in our society, and especially in the context of the United States. So stay tuned. We're going to be going into those subjects, but I think that's why we've given it this kind of bold title, haven't we? Bullying in America. But we're going to focus more on the bullying in the students and young people experience, but we will be tying it into these huge societal forces that are operating.
I'm very interested. The most interesting courses I took in graduate school were Anglo-Saxon and Middle English. So I'm particularly interested in the way language changes. And I was looking at the OED and online etymology, that bullying, perhaps coming from the Dutch, originally meant something very positive, a brother or lover. And then in the 17th century, it kind of morphed from being to a term of endearment, sweetheart, or speaking about someone in a lovely way, to something quite the opposite, which is someone who harasses the weak. And just as silly at one time meant blessed, but now it no longer does. It means something quite the opposite. Could you say something about how this word has undergone this change? And that isn't so much but that is that the concept of bullying is so prominent in our culture today.
Yeah, I think this is one of the situations where etymology doesn't really help us so much. The kind of early uses of this word bullying don't seem to shed much light on the phenomenon now. It's strange, isn't it, how bullying has become now to have a very, very particular and a new meaning. And perhaps I should actually explain what we mean by it. And we is this broad field that's emerged of bullying prevention. And I'm glad there is a field now. When I was growing up, there was quite a lot of denial about bullying. And I think the fact that this name and this word has only really come into prominence in the last 20 years or so is a reflection of the denial that existed about it earlier. So stepping back a little bit and reflecting on what Jim Garrison was saying, bullying is about power. And if you step back far enough, let's take the 30,000-foot view of us humans and our relationships. Broadly speaking, there's two dimensions to all of our relationships, all of our encounters. One of them is affiliation, which is our ability to get close to each other. And obviously there are gradations of that to the most intimate affiliations with our families and our partners. And then there's another strand of every relationship, which is power. And sometimes that power is more explicit than others. But clearly, when we are in a working environment, in nearly every working environment, or there's some aspire otherwise, there is a hierarchy and there's power. And all being well, there's a benign use of power there. And the reality also is that there is a phenomenon of the abuse of power. And bullying falls into that side of the relational equation. It's when someone tries to get power over someone else. And when we're looking at students, and we go into schools a lot, and we train teachers and staff in schools around bullying and how to recognize it. And what we say to the teachers in schools is you need to be looking for four dimensions of the abuse of power of bullying. And the first one's physical, which is the sort of bullying that certainly I experienced when I was at school. And that's shoving and kicking and pushing, and it includes also taking people's possessions and stealing them and throwing them around the school. There's a second channel, which is verbal bullying. So that's teasing and name calling and derogatory comments about people. And researchers used to go into schools and study bullying, and they would ask questions about physical bullying and verbal bullying. And they got this extraordinary finding back that it seemed to be very much skewed to boys, and that according to their surveys, girls really didn't bully. Kind of fascinating, isn't it? So either girls are angels, or they were asking the wrong questions. So which one do you think it was, Bob?
So Nicholas, I'm moving from, for me, what was the irony of going 180 degrees in terms of that word, how one something became the opposite. What is it did you have any personal experience with bullying as a child that led you to be interested in this as a professional?
I'll come to that, but let's just wrap up the definition of bullying so we know what we're talking about here. So although I'm very happy to tell my personal story. As they looked at this field, they realized they needed to include relational bullying. And so researchers started to add relational bullying to the equation. And relational bullying starts in the early years as shunning and exclusion, and then moves into cliques. You're not my friend, you can't sit next to me. And then cliques is much more manipulation behind people's backs through gossip and rumors and talking people down. And then in recent years, we've seen these three types of bullying: physical threats and verbal bullying and relational bullying move online. And of course, that has now the name cyberbullying. So that's what we're looking at today when we talk about bullying, certainly at the school level. My experience with bullying, it's strange. When I was 12, my parents enrolled me in a private school in London, and I managed to get a scholarship there. It was quite a high-flying private school, and it was considered a great honor to get into this school. But I was the smallest child in the school, and a couple of years younger than my peers, and that's not a good recipe for entering a school. And my peers made it very clear that I did not belong at that school. And looking back at that time, I realized that a lot of the bullying that I experienced was socioeconomic bullying. They made a lot of fun of the fact that my parents didn't have a car and that we weren't particularly well dressed, or we had a very average house. And that was a brutal few years, but I don't think I really used the word bullying, at least not in the early years, because back then there was so much denial about bullying. And it was only really when I left school that I started to understand what I'd been through, and I became a human rights lawyer. Uh, couldn't figure out why for a long time, but it kind of makes sense now, doesn't it? Looking back in time to see why I was so keen to fight for the underdog and for justice and fairness and equality. And I then got interested in psychology, and I retrained as a therapist in California. And one of the things that they ask you when you do a training, a master's course in psychology, is do a research study. Maybe it's your thesis, maybe it's your dissertation on a subject that personally interests you psychologically. So I reflected on my experience and I thought, well, I have been significantly impacted by the bullying I went through at school. What's happened to other people who had this experience? And this was around the year 2001. And bullying even then was still not really talked about very much. There was only a very limited amount of research on it. So I put out a call for subjects and said, if you've been bullied at school, please come and talk to me. I want to give you this interview protocol and hear your answers. And so many people came forward. I remember one person came forward saying, I feel like I went through my school years with an X on my back, and the X on my back said target. And so many of the people that we talked to said that those years had scarred them for life. They felt profound shame by what they had been through. Many of them hadn't been able to establish successful relationships in adult life. Many of them hadn't been able to establish a successful working career. And you know, Bob, as I read their accounts and analyzed our findings, I realized I was one of the lucky ones because I got through relatively unscathed and was having had a good job and managed to secure a good relationship. So many of my fellow survivors of bullying had not. And it was out of that experience that I felt the motivation to go into schools and to give them the tools to make sure that students did not have to go through the sort of bullying and harassment that so many of us experienced when we were young.
I hope we can get to a point at some time in this hour to talk about your very impressive training program for teachers. But just given the history, your personal history, have you seen any changes or advances in the research concerning bullying that have allowed you as a professional to understand it on a deeper level?
I think my main learnings around bullying have been through that process of going into schools starting 20 years ago now and trying to figure out with the schools what's going on and how we solve it. And it's been a big journey of learning along the way. First off, I realized early on that bullying was about differences about students who are less than or more than, but some differences kept on showing up again and again. So the students from minority races seem to be way more likely to be bullied. Students from immigrant families, way more likely to be bullied. Students with disabilities, again, way more likely to be bullied. And students that didn't conform to gender norms, so LGBTQ students, 2 to 3 times more likely to be bullied. And that was quite an insight, because I realized, yes, we're talking about bullying, and thankfully bullying is a word that schools seem to be able to tolerate. But in many cases, we were talking about prejudice, which is something that schools find much harder to talk about and to accept that that might be happening on their domains. That led to how the program was shaped. And a second big learning that I saw was that punishment isn't working. So schools routinely over centuries have used punishment as a way to solve behaviors that they don't like. And it's so ingrained in us that both schools and parents routinely call for punishment when someone is doing a behavior that they find offensive. And most schools, thankfully, do and did find bullying offensive. And if it worked, that would be phenomenal. But what seems to happen with punishment is that it's a fairly ineffective tool to change a student's behavior. So if you take the case of a sixth grader who's in the principal's office for behavioral problems, and maybe they get an escalating series of consequences for their behavior, which can often culminate in suspension. What we know about that student is that they are way more likely, after all that punishment in the sixth grade, they're way more likely to be back in the principal's office in the eighth grade. In other words, although we're trying to change their behavior for the better, it seems to have the opposite effect. It doesn't seem to solve their behaviors. And in the case of bullying, it seems to often lead to retaliation against the target. And that was certainly my experience when I was at school. When I was at school, I took it for a year or two, and eventually I cracked, and I told my parents, and they went to the teachers and the head teacher and explained what was going on. And the head teacher then did what was classic back then. They summoned all the students involved and gave them a talking to. Well, you can imagine the result of that. By your smile, I think you're getting it. Yes, the bullying got doubly worse after that. And there's a phrase in many schools that stitches are for snitches, meaning that you should not be blaming or getting your fellow students into trouble. And that is deeply felt by most students. A more perhaps a formal way of describing that is a code of silence that exists amongst students.
I think one of the most impressive things that I found about your training, Nicholas, was that it involves the bully himself, that it brings him into the process of addressing it within the school. Could you just say something about that? It seems to follow from what you said about the perpetuation or the retaliation that happens when bullies are punished. What is your experience of bringing them into the process?
Yes, thank you. It's a good question. We were then left with the question of if punishment's not working, what does work? And it forced us to really analyze what makes a bully and what's driving these behaviors. And what we found was that bullying is a systemic problem. So that's a big word, and let me unpack that a little bit. So it's easy to look at the individual students, at the bully, and to blame them. And we'll get in later to what might be driving their individual behaviors. But if you do that, if you just go and look at the bully, you're missing the bigger picture. Because for every bullying student, for bullying to be sustained in the school, it's very much influenced by what's going on around them. So they need to sustain them. They need students around them who are amplifying the bullying, who are essentially treating them as the leader. They need teachers around them that don't really know what to do. Or in my case, in my school, the teachers had a philosophy that the students should figure it out by themselves. They had this phrase back then in England, it will be the making of them. So that they thought resilience was taught by teachers and administrators not intervening, letting the students sort it out. It's influenced by parents also. So oftentimes parents will group together and then effectively identify some families and some students as not really welcome in the school. So those students are much more likely to be targeted by bullies. So as you look at the bigger picture, you realize there's a much broader influence on bullying than just the individual student. So what that means is, if you want to turn bullying around, systemic problems require systemic solutions. So you have to have a systemic solution to counter this. So we took that information and we pondered, well, how are we going to turn around a specific bullying incident in a school, in a classroom? What do you need to do? So taking that information, what we started to experiment was bringing together the bullying students. So there's often a bully and a bully follower, or several bully followers. So maybe you have 3 or 4 bullying students. But what you do is you bring them together with 3 or 4 of the pro-social students, the students that the others look up to. So you have about 8 students there. And you don't involve the target in that conversation, at least not at this point. And you bring these 8 students together and you sit them around a table. Inevitably, they're going to be saying, are we in trouble? Because that's what every student thinks of. So they're very aware that punishment is the main vehicle that schools use for interventions. But the answer we started to get back to them was, no, you're not in trouble. In fact, you're here to help us solve a situation. And the situation is this. And then the teacher trained by us would walk them into the shoes of the student who had been bullied. So Joaquin is really suffering, and he dreads coming to school. Sunday night is the worst night of the week for him. He's contemplating coming back here on Monday morning. Because when he comes back on Monday morning, he knows that these things are going to happen to him. People are going to say things like, build a wall, and why don't you go back home to where you came from? And when people are playing basketball, they're happy to crash into him and say, oh, sorry, that was an accident, and blame it on the basketball. He has every recess by himself. He has no friends. So you can imagine what's going on for Joaquin. You've all had bad days. He's having a bad life. He's often questioning whether he should stay alive. He's got that bad. He feels profoundly lonely and is really suffering from these comments of go back home and people making fun of his family. So you can see there that it's an active lesson in empathy. This teacher is walking those students into the shoes of Joaquin, and you can transpose that situation to any student. And then the teacher says, what can you do or what can you stop doing to turn the situation around? Now, the first time we did this, I was experimenting myself with leading this. This is before we'd trained thousands of teachers how to do it. And I asked this question, what can you do? What can you stop doing? And this silence opened up in the room. And I thought, oh no, this is like a big hole. I'm just going to fall into it. No one's going to say anything. And then incredibly, the bullying student, I hadn't outed him as the bullying student, but the bullying student said, I could ask the other students to cut it out. And I internally, I thought, oh, I can't believe this. But externally, I said, oh, that's a great suggestion. And what else can you others do? And they started to come up with suggestions. But I've now heard again and again from students, things like, well, we could sit with him at recess, or we could have our lunch with him, or we could invite him over to shoot some hoops with us. And then the facilitator, in that case, it was me, said, those are great ideas. Try them out. You're the solution team. You've come together to solve this problem. So support each other in solving this problem. We're going to meet in 1 week's time, and let me know how you've got on. So we met again in 1 week's time, and it was kind of extraordinary. The bullying has stopped. And I sent them on their way. So that's great work. Keep it going for 1 more week and let me know how it's gone, because you need to cement the change. So we had 3 meetings. Each one's about 20 minutes. They're not particularly long. And at the third meeting, I invited Joaquin back. And it was a chance to reintegrate him into the group and also to reflect on what they'd done. And those students were incredibly and surprisingly moved by that experience, including the bullying student. And I spoke to the bullying student privately after that, and he said, you know, you gave me an out. I was seen as the bully, I know. This gave me an out, and thank you for that. Solution team, from our research, solves about 90% of incidents of bullying. And
Wow.
it is wow. And the other 10%, often there's more complex things going on. One student I remember we worked with had significant levels of depression, and she just couldn't accept and couldn't realize that actually students were being nice to her and being kind to her. She couldn't accept the turnaround. But in 90% of cases, it works. So there's other 10% of cases you've got to do a little bit more work. But as you're saying, Bob, wow, with those sorts of stats, it shows that bullying can be turned around, and that it's not that hard to do.
I actually, as you were telling that story, I'm in the middle of studying the human experience of awe or wonder. Why do we get goosebumps? And as you were telling that story, that's what happened. I just felt this feeling of inspiration and goodness from that narrative, and I can see why it's become your program has become so effective. Could you tell? I'm sure there are people listening in, Nicholas, who would like to know how they can get acquainted with the bullying program here in the United States. For the No Bully, you have, I assume, a website, places where people can get information on this kind of training?
Yeah, absolutely. We're a nonprofit organization, and our mission is to ensure the well-being of children and young people. And we would be thrilled to bring this program into schools, your schools. We've done this in close to 700 schools now across the US. And you can get the most detailed information is from our website at nobully.org, which is just dedicated to this program, which has become so popular. There's also more general information about Power Zero. We're the nonprofit organization that hosts the program at powerzero.org. It looks like there's these information that's coming into the chat window, which is great. So you can click on it there. But please feel free to go to either of those websites. And if you want to bring it to your school, just click on the tell me more, the contact us link, and one of us will get back to you.
I'd like at some point to move to talking about how we could get your training into the halls of Congress. But before we do that, I would like to for you to tell us a little bit about what happened that you segued from, not segued from, but you expanded No Bully into this other program called The Power of Zero. And if you could say something about that, and perhaps something about your experience in other countries. We're talking about bullying in America, but I'm sure people might be interested in your international experience.
Power Zero began from a conversation in a windowless room in the UNESCO building in New York. And to that room, I had invited the head of safety of Facebook, who was and still remains Antigone Davis. And I invited Christopher Castle, who is the head of a section at UNESCO, which is the UN's great agency dealing with education. Back then, I was very much focused on running the No Bully program. And we were hearing such disturbing stories around online bullying, which has come to be called cyberbullying. And there's a bleakness and a lizard brain coldness about the way that students bully online. It seems that when you can't see the whites of someone's eyes, which rather works as a brake upon our tendencies towards aggressive speech, we will say and do things which we would never say face to face. And it was deeply chilling to me. Facebook had their own particular concerns. They were concerns about the abuses of their platform by young people against young people, more broadly than just bullying. And UNESCO also took a broad view of this transition of childhood to the online world. So the reality is that childhood is moving online. By the time that they are 8, most children average about 5 hours a day online. By the time that they are 12, they're tipping to around 7 hours a day online. And by the time that they're 18, it's about 8 or 9 hours a day online, which means that for many, certainly teenagers, the majority of their waking hours is now online. And UNESCO's concern was much broader than ours, which is then focused on bullying. It was focused on children's well-being generally as they made this transition to the online world. So there are many dimensions to that, and we can, if you want to, we can very happy to dive more into that. But out of that came a commitment from us 3 in that room to do something about it. So we wanted to invest in an initiative that would ensure children's well-being as they go online. And that's a big question. It's far too big for any one organization to solve for. So we invoked the power of collaborative action, and we brought together many of the major actors in childhood and tech. And we set up a steering committee with Microsoft and Facebook, Snap, and Xbox have followed. We brought together many of the NGOs dealing with digital literacy, first in the US and the UK, and now across Latin America and Southeast Asia, are major areas of focus. And Power Zero is looking at how do we ensure children's well-being as they navigate this online, offline world that they live in. And we're developing classroom programs that teach life skills to students. We're developing programs for parents around digital parenting. And we have our work cut out for us.
And are you doing this in other countries?
Yes, we started the program in Southeast Asia because, especially we started in the Philippines. That's the world's #1 user of the internet. Can you any guesses how long the average person in the Philippines spends online every day? Any idea, Bob?
I'm afraid to ask.
Afraid to suggest anything. It's over 10 hours. It's 10 hours and 6 minutes a day. Wow. Which is extraordinary. A lot of that's on Facebook. This is a phenomenon that perhaps is not often talked about, but Facebook has struck a deal in many countries with the telecom providers where they will essentially pay for users access to Facebook and WhatsApp. So people in many countries, it's expensive to connect. But that problem of accessibility is solved by Facebook by saying you can use our platform for free.
Do you, I'm really interested, first of all, I think it's really the statistics from the studies that people have done, where there's this enormous improvement in the schools where your program has been utilized, and the principles that you on which your program is based, it seems to me, can be easily adapted in other communities and families, even maybe especially in adult environments. But I noticed that someone had put into the chat, can you talk about bullying in what we might call Trump's America? That is what we have, I think, is maybe, well, certainly not for the first time, but in such a dramatic way, the employment of bullying for political power and whether or not, how that affects bullying in schools or might affect it. I don't know if studies have been done, but I'd just be interested in your perspective on how it seems to me, I guess one thing to say is that it seems to me that bullying can be contagious, just as it can be successfully and compassionately countered. There's an aspect of it that tends to be contagious. And so one sees what seems to be imitation, contamination of bullying in the political arena.
Thank you. It's a good question. And I think I would widen it to say that norms are contagious. So you were talking about the awe you felt as I described the solution team. Essentially is promoting a norm of empathy and fairness. And that norm in itself we found to be contagious. And the students who've gone through solution teams so often say, we want to do more of these. And they take the message out to the school that no one needs to put up with bullying, and they're there to help solve it. So that's an example of the positive, the contagion of, or perhaps I'll avoid the word contagion, but the spread of positive norms. And the same is also true of some of the more negative norms that seems to have accelerated in the last 8 years. So let's wind the clock back to 2016. You've been referencing, I think, Donald Trump's presidency and the question of the Trump effect. So we should talk a little bit about that and what we know about it. So our mission is to solve bullying in schools and cyberbullying in schools. So we're very astute to what's going on in schools and the changes that we're seeing there. And when President Trump was elected, and after that acrimonious political campaign with Hillary Clinton, we were getting reports from schools that students were saying to other students, let's build a wall. We were sent a photograph from one school where the football team had held up signs saying, go back home and let's build a wall, which were directed at the opposition students who were from a high population Latino school. And we were hearing many accounts from teachers back then of the overt levels of racism that they were witnessing in their schools. The Southern Poverty Law Center were a bit more rigorous about it, and they went into schools and started asking teachers what they were observing in that month after President Trump was elected. And I thought you'd ask this question, so I made some notes of what they found. So the Southern Poverty Law Center surveyed K-12 teachers, counselors, and administrators. And of the more than 10,000 educators who responded, 80% reported heightened anxiety on the part of marginalized students, including immigrants, Muslims, African Americans, and LGBT students. And then here's the kicker. More than 2,500 educators reported, so that's a quarter of the people who reported on this survey. More than 2,500 educators reported specific incidents of bigotry and harassment that can be directly traced to election rhetoric, including graffiti, such as swastikas. This is in the US. Assaults on students and teachers, property damage, fights and threats of violence. In some instances, white students even used Donald Trump as an epithet, screaming his name in threatening ways at students of color. And it's worth reading that report from the Southern Poverty Law Center. They got this extraordinary quote from a Georgia elementary school teacher who said, "This is my 21st year of teaching." This is an elementary school in Georgia. "This is my 21st year of teaching. This is the first time I've had a student call another student the N-word. This incident occurred the day after a conference with the offender's mother. During the conference, the mother made her support of Trump known and expressed her hope that the blacks would soon know their place again." Shocking. So what is the Trump effect? The Trump effect is really the sense of enablement that people seem to feel as a result of what Trump was expressing, both in terms of the policies he was proposing. And you'll remember that he proposed a policy that would essentially ban immigrants from high Muslim populations, which is a big source of contention in the early years of his presidency. What we're seeing through the Trump effect is a sense of enablement or entitlement, the entitlement to express views that are racist that maybe were held privately before, but a sense of entitlement that those views could be expressed publicly and even directly towards minority groups.
It seems to me that we have something which, if one read about it in a novel, would be shocking to see it play out. And it seems to me that it is being imitated in various places. But they recently, as they were talking about the new debate, presidential debate, they showed the pictures of the Clinton and Trump debate, and those pictures of him as a bully walking behind her, looming over her, insulting her. And it seems to me that, and this brings in one of the key things of bully about power and the use of male power to intimidate and bully women. And this also means this becomes, it also seems to metastasize into various communities and areas of our world where now with, and we may not get to AI, but there certainly is that aspect about it. But when you have something that is so public and so blatant and so celebrated, as it were, what, somebody who has studied this, what can you say to us as a society that is, again, one can talk about various elements of this, but the Trump's heroes seem to be bullies like Putin and the other, a number of autocrats. So that, I don't know, I want to stop because I want your perspective, but it seems to me we are in a place in our history we've never been in before. And I think it is something with an election coming up that we need to be gravely concerned about.
Well, our work and my work is very much a reflection on the use of power and the good use of power and the abuse of power. And people often ask me, why are you called Power Zero? And the reason why we took that name, because we realized that we were teaching students to use their power well, with zero violence, zero hate, and zero bullying. So that's the power of zero. And in getting there, we studied a lot of the greats when it came to the use of power. So I'm talking about people like Nelson Mandela and Malala and Mahatma Gandhi, because their lives, certainly towards the end of all of their lives, Malala's still very young, but the other two shifted over time to a point where they espoused nonviolence as a way of going through the world. So those are the inspiring stories about the use of power. And the problem with political discourse right now is it does influence us, and for better or for worse, they are our leaders, the people who are in Congress and politically powerful, and they are modeling a form of discourse which is quite abusive when it comes to power, and that does have an impact both online and offline, and it's concerning.
I'm attending a conference at Claremont next week, and I'm talking about ways that we see inattentional blindness, deliberate blindness. And one of the examples I'm using of how we become blind is a series of pictures that Trump has created, his followers have created, that show him sitting with Jesus, or Jesus over him, or Jesus blessing him. And I also noticed that Trump is identifying with Navalny, with Mandela. He, as a bully, associates himself with people who have been tremendously bullied. Do you find that? How would you, talk about that, where the bully puts himself and identifies with somebody who has been tremendously bullied?
I'm going to answer that, but I'm going to jump out of the system a little bit and answer it at a slightly higher level. So I think it's a fascinating phenomenon that we're being pulled into giving Donald Trump attention. And let's step back a little bit, because we're living in the attention economy. And the platforms that we use now to get a lot of our news and learn what's going on in the world are social media platforms that are very skilled at getting our attention. And there's a phenomenon where we are much more attracted to the shocking news and the dark news and the unbelievable news, even if it is actually unbelievable to the point of just being made up, than we are to the nice story about the woman selling flowers at the corner of the street who gave a bunch of roses to a homeless person, which is not going to make the front page. And that's what we're up against now. And I think we can't really have this conversation today about bullying without really understanding what's happening in this extraordinary digital revolution that we are experiencing. This combination of personal computers and the internet, and now generative AI. And one of the features of these huge technological changes, and humanity's been going through those since the beginning of time, is that it redistributes power. And the old systems, the old hierarchies are being dismantled before our eyes. And the old ways of being are being dismantled before our eyes. So we can't really understand bullying in the 21st century without understanding the impact of technology on how we are, our nature, and how we come together as a society, and how we're reorganizing as a society.
And it seems to me that one of the things that ties into what you've been talking about is that in recent studies, I was just reading about Gen Zers' inability to distinguish between real and artificial or artificially made photographs of scenes. They show them too, and the younger generation gets almost all of their news and spends so much time on media, had a very much more difficult time distinguishing between false and true, between real and unreal. And it seems to me that this presents a challenge in terms of bullying because of the ability to manipulate narratives, to manipulate visuals, to use them in a way to bully. I mean, people are being bullied into things that if they had reflection or had a wider range of discriminating abilities would reject.
So thank you. And it goes back to this phenomenon of emboldenment, if that's the noun. I'm not sure if it is. That we're seeing with the online world. We're also seeing with the advent of generative AI, there's a redistribution of power, and there's an ease for almost anyone to create very convincing pictures, very convincing videos that are distortions of the truth. And in the early days of generative AI, there was some sort of hope that we could watermark those and we could track them as generated by AI and therefore not real. That's now being bypassed. And we are rapidly reaching a point that none of us are going to be able to have sufficient discernment to know what's true and what's false. It's getting too good. It's going to trick pretty much all of us. The next generation of generative AI is being deployed right now to create almost counter apps that have sufficient critical thinking that they can discern for us what's true and what's false. That's going to be needed. So it's not that Gen Z is particularly weak-minded and unable to exercise their critical thinking functions. It's because rapidly their critical thinking functions are being outsmarted by generative AI.
Nicholas, you and I had a conversation recently about what parents and grandparents can do about bullying. Between Gloria, who's sitting next to me, and we have 19 grandchildren of various ages. And of course, like all parents and grandparents, we're interested in the corrosive effect of bullying on those closest to us. Do you have any words of wisdom for people who might be looking down from or from the distance of our generation to younger generation?
Well, first off, yes, join the Para Zero Parents Club, which is open to parents and grandparents. And if you want to find out more information about that, log on to parazero.org and either sign up for the newsletter or reach out to me through the Contact Us form. It's going to take all of us coming together to make the internet a place that's fit for children and our grandchildren. I'm running one actually tomorrow evening. We run a series of learning sessions for parents and grandparents. You can find that actually if you go into Eventbrite and search for Who's Controlling My Children, which is the talk I'm going to be giving tomorrow. But I think one of the most powerful things that you can do is to talk about your own values to your children and grandchildren, and to talk about the importance of kindness and how kindness needs to extend into the online world. That when we are online, maybe we can't see the person, but it's as important as ever to exhibit kindness and respect.
Somebody said that their mother always said, it doesn't cost a dime to be kind. And yet how easily we forget that. We're going to bring Jim back in. And as we do so, I just would like you to have a moment to say anything that you would like to say about this conversation we've had. And then we'll invite Jim in, and come on in, Jim, and then we can get ready to go into the after chat when we've finished with this little conversation here. But Nicholas, is there anything else you would like to leave with the audience who's been blessed to listen in to your wisdom and your experience.
Thank you, Bob. Yes, the main thing that strikes me is you have a very important mission at Humanity Rising and at Ubiquity University. And that mission is to bring, as far as I can see, to bring values back and humanistic values back into the world. And I think they've never been so much under assault as they are right now. So thank you for your work.
Oh, Jim?
Thank you so much, Nicholas and Bob. As always, thank you. You're dealing with such a subtle issue in a way, Nicholas, and this is the first point that I want to raise, is the relationship between the external world and the emergence of bullies, say, on the school ground. Bob mentioned Donald Trump. You have someone running for president who is clearly a bully, relishes in being a bully, is supported by his followers because he's a bully, and makes no apologies and acts without constraint in these matters. You know, as Gabor Mate has pointed out in his recent major work, The Myth of Normal, our whole society, from pre-birth to the birth process, to how mothers are treated while they're pregnant, to how kids are treated when they're young, social media is infused with violence. It's infused with trauma. So when a young boy becomes a bully in the schoolyard, one always has to ask, how much is this the young boy reflecting what he's seeing in the world around him, and how much is a genuine bullying behaviors and attitudes emerging from inside him. And then a corollary question is, if you punish the bully, as many people do, but you don't take away all those aspects of society which embody bullying, I just wonder how one thinks about that, how one thinks about the relationship between the external bullying world and the emergence of a bully in the schoolyard.
Well, let's talk about the emergence of a bully and the young boy growing up, and let's maybe put him in a city, and he's being taught that the most important thing is respect, and that if anyone slights him, he should assert himself back. And that grows over time, and he becomes a teenager, and someone again has slighted him, and he's getting the message back then that there's a nobility in fighting back, and maybe fighting back quite aggressively. And so these values of the kind of street gang really feed into his values, his personal values. From his perspective, he's not going to turn the other cheek. From his perspective, it makes sense to assert himself. And so although we may not agree with people like Donald Trump, there's a boldness that he's asserting, a bold assertion of power that has the boldness of not caring what other people think or the impact that you make on other people. And if you're feeling somewhat disempowered anyway, that's attractive. It helps you feel stronger. It helps you feel like you are something. It comes back to this question, maybe a slightly fragile sense of respect and self-respect. Andrew Tate, the TikTok influencer, is pushing a similar message of misogyny and showing women that what their place is. And if you look at his attraction, is particularly to older boys, younger male teens, there's a sense of, okay, he's giving me a sense of purpose and pride. I can do this. And it's pretty easy for me to put my place in the pecking order by putting down the girls around me. So I'll say derogatory comments to the girls around me, like, go make me a sandwich, which is one of the Andrew Tate's lines, which they think immensely funny if you're a boy trying to put down girls. And we're reverting to a 1950s style misogyny there. So none of us, I'm sure, on this Zoom call would endorse that. But I think it's important to step into the shoes of especially boys growing up now to understand where they're coming from.
Yeah, yeah. And there was a very interesting observation in the chat early on. I'll see if I can find it here. A woman was saying that one of the reasons why boys end up bullies is because they have naturally more adrenaline than girls. They're more kinetic. They're forced to sit at a desk all day and memorize information. And then when they get the 15 minutes of recess, oftentimes what is experienced as bullying is just the irrational exuberance of a little boy that's been cooped up for the last 4 hours, having to sit quietly with his hands folded behind the desk, when the natural inclination of young boys, as we know from all kinds of studies, is they learn as they're kinetic. It's not natural for a young boy to sit quietly as it is for young girls. So I'm just wondering how that fits into when you go into a school, do you concentrate on context? Because that's a major part in producing bullying, or do you really just focus on the social interaction between the bully and the people around him or her that are experiencing the brunt of that aggression?
It's a good question, and we should talk about girls as well, because I've been focusing on boys there. But the best remedy for bullying is to focus on the culture of the school. It's called taking a whole school approach. And that ties back to the point I made earlier, Jim, about bullying is a systemic problem, and systemic problems require systemic solutions. So the best way to turn bullying around and prevent it is to create a school where every student feels like they belong, where every student feels like they are accepted for who they are. And to get there, you have to really unpack the often unspoken values and attitudes in that school, which often are quite fragmented in terms of who belongs and who doesn't belong. And to help the school, and this is what we do in our work at No Bully, to help the school create a new social vision, a social vision statement of what their values are and the sort of community that they want to be. And then within that context, students start to feel more confident that they matter, that they belong, that it's okay to be them. It's okay to develop the sort of identity that feels true to them. That's incredibly important. If you can get there, and it's not easy, and we can talk about how schools have managed to do it, then students start to be able to relax and don't feel this need so much to take power from others, because they tend to those behaviors more when they feel insecure. And as we know, the teenage years are a huge time of insecurity. And they can start then, as they start to relax, their more aggressive narcissistic impulses tend to fall away. And the natural kindness and sense of empathy that I think nearly 98% of students have can shine through. But specifically on girls, so yes, boys are more physical by and large. Girls bully to the same degree as boys, just in a different venue. And girl bullying tends to be more relational. It tends to be more behind the scenes. When it comes to the online world, boys are tending more to video games, and it's more kind of explicit smack talk in video games that they are engaging in. Girls tend more to more classic social media, and it's in those venues that they can be extraordinarily cutting and destructive of each other. So we shouldn't forget that girls need to be attended to as much as boys.
Mm. Mm.
Let me just say a very quick word about the importance of the humanities. I think that when we get away from teaching critical thinking, when people don't read novels and don't bring into their lives the emotional world of the arts, it seems to me they set themselves up, or they're set up to be less discriminating. That is, when the humanities, it seems to me, allow us to broaden our ability to see the world and to see humanity. And so, as a former professor of literature, I am very keen on our helping young people to be into that world where they can explore and expand into the vast complexity but beauty of humanity.
That's a really interesting point, Bob, and it kind of reminds me as they're tracking the level of the extent of reading and really the demise of reading, they're also tracking against that reductions in empathy, and you're exactly right. So in the mix here, why are we getting more aggressive? Why are more humanistic values falling by the side? Maybe part of the mix is the lack of reading and that process of being essentially led into the shoes of someone else that a book gives you.
And is there a book, Cliff? I noticed someone said, can you recommend any books that people might read on bullying?
Books on bullying. It's slightly different, but I think everyone should be reading Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, which touches into that somewhat. But I think we can't really understand what's going on right now if we don't understand the online world and the impact that that's having on the next generation.
Well, that, in fact, I think it's a really good point that you're making, Bob, is there are many factors that are coming into play, and, the stripping away of the humanities, the stripping away of art courses, music courses, and the increase, as you probably know better than almost anyone, Nicholas, of loneliness, and depression, and a sense of, I think, 65% of, at least I think, American, if not global youth, believe, that we're doomed. And so again, this context within which bullying emerges and nurtured is a very complex ecology of deficiencies in the culture. We have the rise of social media, and everybody gets lonelier. We have all kinds of ways to interact, and people are feeling more and more isolated.
Yes.
We have all these advertisements on how to be happy and fulfilled, and we're more depressed, anxious, and alienated. And so I would just love, as we're closing out here, to get from you a general comment about, that again, this complex relationship between the outer world and the various trends that are characterizing, particularly our young people, within which bullying emerges as of singular importance.
And I think the window into that is so our mission at ParaZero is ensuring children's well-being in this digital age, and I think the window into that is to track what is going on around well-being, because at the end of the day, I think well-being is one of the most important metrics about society. And as we start to track well-being, as you're rightly saying, Jim, we've seen usually statistics in social sciences are fairly flat. They go along like this. There's a bit of variation up and down as you track things like loneliness levels and anxiety levels and depression levels and various other metrics of well-being or the absence of well-being. What we've seen in the last decade is a spike right up like that. So to about 2010, if you tracked loneliness and anxiety and depression in teenagers, it was fairly like that. And then in 2010, it kind of goes up like that. And in the space of a decade, it doubles for loneliness, for anxiety, and for depression for teenagers, not just in the US, but pretty much across the world, almost across the whole world. And some of the blame in Jonathan Haidt's book, he put some of the blame for that on social media. And I think that's part of the picture. But painting the bigger picture, as we predict the end of the world as we know it, and climate change is going to radically change the future for the next generation, as we see that standards of living for this generation are going to be significantly lower than what their parents and even their grandparents had. It's a slightly strange thing to be saying to them, you should be happy. Yeah. So the big answer, as we kind of look at these big societal forces, is of course they're not happy. This is a fairly bleak world that we're handing them off to.
Totally.
And really, it falls upon us. We can't just hand the problems across to them and say, well, it's going to be up to you to solve that. We have to solve these big problems, and we need to be doing that now.
Yeah, brilliantly put, Nicholas. Thank you so much. And Bob, thank you as well. I think we'll adjourn to the after chat. Nicholas and Bob will join everyone. You'll see the link in the chat box. You also receive the link in your Zoom reminder for today. Bullying is pervasive, and being aware of this is really critical for any sense of overall well-being. And then tomorrow, everyone, we're going to begin a 2-day program on one of the seminal books of our time, One Nation Under Blackmail, which is the story of the deep state as it's emerged in the United States and internationally over the past 80 years. And we'll be having a presentation, a 2-day presentation by Linda White, one of our PhD students at Ubiquity University. But Nicholas, Bob, thank you so much for this very deeply inspiring treatment on bullying in America and globally. It's been very, very informative, and it's an issue that all of us need to pay very close attention to. So thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Nicholas. See you in the after chat.
Thank you, everyone. See you tomorrow. Bye for now.